Chapter 1. A long, long time ago, there were many unknown places, and in those unknown places, there were many unknown people. A fireball hung in the distance in the wilderness at dusk. The red light it emitted was like a huge flame, spreading slowly and steadily. The newly grown moss after the snow on the wilderness melted, spreading everywhere like a burned scar. It was quiet all around. Only the cries of eagles and the jumping of gazelles could be heard occasionally. 3 people appeared in the empty wilderness. They gathered under a small tree, which was rare in the wilderness. They did not greet each other, but bowed their heads at the same time, as if there was something very interesting under the tree that was worth studying and thinking about. 2 colonies of ants were surrounding the light brown tree root, which was exposed on the cold soil. Perhaps it was because it was difficult to find another perfect home like the tree root in this wasteland, so the battle was particularly fierce. After a while, there were thousands of ant corpses left. It seemed to be a bloody and tragic scene, but in fact, it was just a small black dot. The weather was still very cold, but the 3 people under the tree were not wearing much clothes. They did not seem to be afraid of the cold. They just watched attentively for a long time. Suddenly, one of them said in a low voice, "What is the great way of the ant kingdom in the secular world?" The person who spoke had innocent eyes and a thin figure. He was still a young man, wearing a white, thin shirt without a collar. He carried a thin wooden sword without a scabbard on his back. His black hair was finely combed into a bun, with a wooden fork in it. The fork looked like it could fall at any time, but it was as unshakable as a pine tree growing on a mountain. When the chief monk was preaching, I saw countless flying ants bathing in the light. The person who said this was a young monk. He was wearing a tattered kapok kasaya, and the new stubble on his head was black and sharp. It was as sure and determined as his face and the way he spoke. The wooden sword youth shook his head and said, "Ants that can fly will eventually fall. They will never touch the sky. If you insist on thinking like this, then you will never understand what Taoist heart is." The young monk closed his eyes slightly and looked at the ants that were scattering their limbs at his feet. He said, "I heard that your abbey dean recently accepted a child with the surname Chen. You should understand that a place like Jishou Abbey will never have only one genius like you." The young man with the wooden sword raised his eyebrows and replied sarcastically, "I don't understand why a guy like you, who can't be restrained, is qualified to travel the world on behalf of Xiankong Temple." The young monk did not respond to his provocation. The young man with the wooden sword on his back said expressionlessly, "It is also said that a sage will appear every 1,000 years, but who has really seen a sage in these thousands of years? If you really don't believe it, why don't you dare to step over that black line?" No one dared to step over that black line, that shallow trench, not even the proud and powerful young men. Ants could crawl over it, long-limbed insects could jump over it, gazelles could leap over it, eagles could fly over it, but humans could not. It was precisely because they were humans that they did not dare to step over it. The young man with the wooden sword on his back raised his head to look at the sky and asked, "If that child really exists, then, where is he?" By this time, more than half of the setting sun had sunk into the ground, and the darkness of the night was surging in from all directions. The temperature in the wilderness dropped sharply, and a frightening atmosphere began to envelop the entire world. Night has fallen, and he is everywhere. Where can you find him? The young man in animal skin broke the silence that had been there for a long time. His voice was deep and rough, unbefitting of his age. It buzzed and vibrated like the incessant rolling of a river, or like the incessant grinding of a rusty sword against a hard rock. After saying this, he left in a special way. Several flames suddenly burst out from his 2 hard and thick bare legs, covering the lower part of the young man's body in a crimson fire. The roaring wind made the gravel on the ground roll rapidly. Then, as if an invisible force had grabbed his neck, his body was lifted more than 100 feet into the sky, and then he fell down with a whistling sound, smashing hard on the ground. Then he jumped up again, like a stone jumping irregularly into the distance. It looked extremely clumsy, but extremely fast. I only know that his surname is Tang, but I don't know what his full name is. The young man with the wooden sword on his back said thoughtfully, if we met at another time and place, only one of us could survive. His disciple is so powerful, how powerful is his master? I heard that his master has been practicing the 23-year cicada cultivation these years. I wonder if he will carry a heavy shell when he breaks through. It was quiet around him, and no one answered. He looked back in confusion. He saw that the young monk's eyes were closed, and his eyelids were trembling rapidly. It seemed that he was thinking about something troubling. In fact, since the young man in animal skin said those words about the dark night, the young monk had been trapped in this strange state. Sensing the gaze, the young monk slowly opened his eyes and grinned. The original determination and calmness in his smile had already turned into benevolence out of nowhere. His parted lips were a bloody mess, and it was his tongue that had been chewed up. The young man with the wooden sword frowned. The young monk slowly took off the prayer beads on his wrist and solemnly hung them around his neck. Then he started to walk away. His steps were heavy and steady, and seemed to be extremely slow. But in the blink of an eye, he had already disappeared into the distance. There was no one else under the tree. All the emotions on the young man's face had faded away, leaving only absolute calmness, or absolute indifference. He looked at the shadow in the dust in the north, which kept jumping up and down like a stone, and shouted in a low voice, "Devil." He looked at the back of the young monk in the west, who was walking silently with his head down, and said, "Heretic. Insignificant. Devil and heretic are insignificant." After saying this, the thin wooden sword on the young man's back vibrated and made a strange buzzing sound. With a swoosh, it rose into the air and turned into a stream of light, cutting the small tree in the wilderness into 53,333 pieces. The branches and trunks were all turned into powder, and the powder fell on the ants who had forgotten about life and death. The mute opens his mouth to speak. "Put some salt on the cake." The young man sang and walked toward the east. The thin wooden sword floated in the air a few meters behind him and followed him silently. In the first year of the Tianqi era of the Tang Empire, there was a strange phenomenon in the wilderness. All the world wayfarers gathered there. Since then, Qi Nian, the successor of the Xiankong temple, had practiced the vow of silence and no longer spoke. Tang, the successor of the devil's doctrine, hid in the desert and disappeared. Yi Su, the successor of the Jishou Abbey, broke through the hermetic training and traveled around all the countries. The three of them had their own gains. However, the three of them did not know that on that day, when night was about to fall, at the other end of the black ravine that they did not dare to cross, near the direction of the capital city, there sat a scholar wearing straw sandals and a tattered coat. The scholar did not seem to feel the power and sternness represented by the black ravine. He held a scroll in his left hand and a wooden dipper in his right. When he had nothing to do, he would rest when he was tired, and drink water when he was thirsty. He was covered in dust, but his face was peaceful. It was not until the three of them had left and the shallow black ravine on the wilderness was gradually flattened by the wind and sand that the scholar stood up. He dusted himself off, tied the wooden dipper to his waist, and carefully hid the scroll in his coat. He took one last look in the direction of the capital before leaving. There was a long alley in the capital of Chang'an. On the east side was the residence of the official of council, and on the west side was the residence of the Xianwei general. Seeing the two corpses in the woodshed, the captain reported loudly after an examination, "Not a single one is missing. Not a single one is missing." The simplest way to interpret the words, "unworldly sublime being," was that sublime beings usually lived outside the mortal world, and those who lived outside the mortal world could easily be sublime beings. There was actually some truth hidden in this nonsense. What they feared was something mortals could not touch, and what they were happy about was something mortals could not understand. Therefore, the mortal world did not know what happened outside the mortal world, and the people outside the mortal world would not care about the scenes of life and death or the joy of new life that were happening in the mortal world. They would not care about the butcher's scale losing weight, the drunkard's cellar being eaten by rats, the Xianwei general of the imperial court dying, or a civil official giving birth to a daughter. The joys and sorrows of the two worlds were never connected. If they could be connected, they would be sages. There was a high mountain on the outskirts of the capital Chang'an. Half of the mountain peak was hidden in the clouds, and a figure was slowly climbing between the cliffs to the west of the back mountain. The man's back was extremely tall, and he wore a black overcoat over his unlined shirt. He was carrying a food box in his hand. Swaying against the wind, he walked to a cave and sat down. He opened the food box, took out his chopsticks, picked up a piece of ginger and put it into his mouth, chewed it carefully, and picked up 2 pieces of mutton. He sighed with satisfaction and praised. Under the setting sun, the capital Chang'an was gradually shrouded in darkness. Dark clouds of rain were faintly floating in the distance. The tall man looked at somewhere in the capital and said with emotion, "I seem to see you in the past." Then he looked up at the sky, holding the chopsticks in his right hand, and said, "As for you, what's the use no matter how high you fly?" Obviously, the 2 sentences were meant for 2 different people. After a moment of silence, the tall man picked up the rice wine beside him and drank it in one gulp. He raised the empty bowl and looked around the capital, saying respectfully, "The wind rises, the rain falls, and the night is coming." When he said that, a gust of wind came from outside the mountain, causing his clothes to flutter. The old trees between the rocks shook violently, and the mountain rocks fell. When he said the word "rain falls," the rain clouds that floated above the capital city suddenly darkened. Countless drops of rain turned into a pillar and poured down in the last of the twilight. When he finished speaking, the night sky just happened to occupy half of the vault of heaven, and the darkness was like the eyes of the Lord of Hades. The tall man put down the bowl and angrily muttered, "It's so damn dark." Chapter 2. In the spring of the 13th year of the Tianqi era of the Tang Empire, it rained in the city of Wei. This military border city was located at the northwest end of the vast territory of the Tang Empire. In order to prevent the barbarians from the grassland from invading, the 4 earthen walls were built very thick, looking like a solid earthen enclosure. In the dry season, the dust on the earthen walls would be blown away by the northwest wind, and then fall on the simple barracks and the soldiers. The whole world would be covered with earthen yellow dust. When people shook their bedding at night, it would cause a sandstorm. During the spring drought, the rain came at the right time, and was warmly welcomed by the soldiers. Since last night, the rain had washed away the dust on the roofs, and seemed to have brightened people's eyes. At least Ma Shixiang's eyes were very bright at this time. As the highest military officer in the city of Wei, he was very humble at this time. Although he was a little dissatisfied with the yellow muddy footprints on the expensive carpet, he managed to cover up his dissatisfaction into a trace of surprise. He bowed respectfully to the old man in a dirty robe beside the short table, and asked in a low voice, "Dear boss, is there anything else that the noble in the tent needs? If the noble insists on leaving tomorrow, I can send a team of 100 guards to accompany her at any time. I will make a record and send it to the military ministry immediately." The old man smiled gently, pointed at the figures in the tent, and shook his head to show that he had no objection. At this moment, a cold and proud woman's voice came from the tent, "No need. Just mind your own business." This morning, after the caravan rushed into the city of Wei in the rain, it did not take Ma Shixiang long to guess the identity of the noble in the caravan. Therefore, he did not have any objection to the arrogant indifference of the other party. The person in the tent was silent for a moment, and suddenly said, "From the city of Wei to the capital, the road around the Min Mountain is difficult to travel. It seems that the rain will continue for some time, and maybe some mountain roads will be washed away. Find me a guide from the army." Ma Shixiang was startled, and thought of a hateful guy. After a moment of silence, he lowered his head and replied, there is a ready-made candidate. Outside the barracks, the lieutenants looked at each other with different expressions on their faces. Some were regretful, some were reluctant, some were glad, and some were shocked. However, it was obvious that none of them had expected Ma Shixiang to choose that person to be the noble's guide. "General, are you really going to let him go just like that?" a lieutenant asked in surprise. The city of Wei was not big, and there were no more than 300 soldiers and officers. The military camp was far away from the bustling area, and sometimes it was more like a bandit's den. The so-called general was just a deputy general of the lowest rank. However, Ma Shixiang was very strict in managing his army, or in other words, the leader of the Wei gang liked to be called general. Therefore, his subordinates didn't dare to forget to add the word general in their daily conversations. Ma Shixiang wiped the rainwater off his face and looked at the yellow-brown puddles around the barracks. He sighed and said, "We can't keep him in this desolate place forever. The recommendation letter has been here for almost half a year, and he has a bright future ahead of him. Anyway, he's going to the capital for the academy's preliminary examination, and it's just in the same direction as that noble's team. Let's do him a favor." "I don't think that noble will appreciate it," the lieutenant answered angrily. The door of the barracks behind them was pushed open, and a pretty maidservant walked out. She looked at Ma Shixiang and the lieutenants and said coldly, "Take me to see that guide." As the personal maidservant of the noble, she didn't hide her slight arrogance in front of the frontier generals of the imperial court. The gatekeeper of the prime minister, the personal maidservant of the noble, and the guest of the prince were all troublesome roles in the officialdom. They were the most troublesome ones in the officialdom. Ma Shixiang really didn't want to deal with these kinds of people. After a few casual words, he waved his hand to summon a lieutenant and ordered him to take the maidservant of the noble to find the guide. The rain had stopped for a while, and the city of Wei looked especially fresh after the light rain. Along the road, there were a few willows blooming with spring green. However, although the scenery was good, the city was too small. After a few steps, the captain led the maidservant to their destination, which was a simple but lively barracks. Hearing the noise, curses, and orders coming from the door, the maidservant slightly frowned, thinking that someone dared to drink in the military camp in broad daylight. The curtain was blown up by the wind, and the sound inside suddenly became clear. It was indeed a finger-guessing game, but not a proper drinking game. Hearing the order, the maidservant's pretty face flushed with shame and anger, and she secretly clenched her fists in her sleeves. "Let's play the lecherous finger-guessing game." "Who is lecherous?" "You are lecherous." "Who is lecherous?" "I am lecherous." "Who is lecherous?" "He is lecherous." The dirty orders came back and forth, and the noise was endless. After a long time, there was no winner. The maidservant, who looked more and more annoyed, lifted a corner of the curtain and looked inside with an extremely unfriendly look. At first glance, she saw a young man at the square table. The young man was about 15 or 16 years old, wearing a standard cotton shirt commonly seen in the army. The front of the cotton shirt was full of oil stains, and his black hair was a little curly and oily, either naturally or because he had not washed it for several years. But his face was very clean, so his eyebrows and eyes were particularly clear, and so were the freckles on his cheeks. "Who is lecherous?" "You are lecherous." Contrary to the dirty finger-guessing game, the young man's expression was particularly focused and serious. Not only was there not the slightest hint of lechery, but even his eyebrows revealed a bit of holiness and loftiness. His right hand kept making rock-paper-scissors gestures in front of him. His fists were like the wind, and his knives were full of killing intent. It seemed that winning or losing this finger-guessing game was more important than his own life. A few green-headed flies that had survived in the harsh environment of the Northwest and possessed strong vitality were trying to land on the front of the young man's cotton shirt that was stained with oil, but they were always driven away by the wind generated by his fists. I won. The long finger-guessing game, which seemed to squeeze all the air out of the lungs of the two people at the table, finally came to an end. The black-haired young man waved his right arm hard, announcing his victory. He smiled very happily, and a lovely dimple appeared on his left cheek. The young man's opponent refused to admit defeat, insisting that the young man changed his game when he called who was lecherous, so the room suddenly fell into a fierce quarrel. The soldiers watching the game on the side all had their own sides, and no one could convince the other. At this moment, someone shouted, as usual, "Listen to Sang Sang." Everyone turned to look at the corner of the room. There, a girl around 11 or 12 years old was moving a bucket of water. She was short and skinny, with dark skin and ordinary eyes. The maid uniform on her body, which her master had stolen from somewhere, was obviously a little too loose. The hem kept dragging on the ground. It was obvious that it was very strenuous for her to move a bucket that might be even heavier than her. The little handmaiden named Sang Sang put down the bucket and turned around. The soldiers looked at her nervously, like the rich guests in the casino waiting for the dealer to open the final big or small, and it was obvious that this was not the first time such a scene had happened. The little handmaiden frowned and glanced at the young man, and then looked at the indignant soldier across the table. She said seriously, "In the 23rd round, you used scissors, and he used fists. But you said he was lecherous, so you had already lost at that time." There was a roar of laughter in the room, and the crowd dispersed. The soldier cursed as he handed over the money. Chapter 3. It's okay if she's your handmaiden, but didn't you pick her up from a pile of dead bodies? Didn't you say that you two depended on each other? Even if we take 10,000 steps back and say that she is your maidservant, don't you think that she is still too young to bear such heavy and arduous labor? Why is this young lad so lazy? Why can't he do it himself? Perhaps it triggered some bad childhood memories, or perhaps it was because her imagination of some beautiful feelings had been completely destroyed by Ning Quebec. The maidservant pushed open the fence and walked in. Her eyes fell on the bamboo chair and the old book that the lad had been reading seriously. She said with slight sarcasm, "I thought you'd read some great works of sages that could make you forget everything that happened around you. I didn't expect that it's just the article on the response of the Tao that can be bought anywhere in the market. Do people like you also have extravagant hopes to step into the path of cultivation?" Ning Kei sat up and looked curiously at the well-dressed young lady who should never have appeared in the city of Wei. Then he looked at the awkward captain and explained after a short pause, "I could only buy this one, so I had to make do with it. I'm just curious. I don't have any extravagant hopes." The maidservant obviously didn't expect that the lad would answer so naturally and casually, which made her stunned. Then she looked at the little handmaiden who was pouring ashes from the stove by the door and said unhappily, "How can there be a man like you in the Tang Empire?" Ning Kei frowned in confusion and followed the man's gaze to Sang Sang, who was standing by the window with a rag in her hand. He understood where the sharpness of the man's words came from. A dimple appeared on his left cheek, and he said with a smile, "It seems that you are older than me. How about, you take me as a boy instead of a man?" The maidservant had probably never seen such a shameless person in her life. Her fists slowly clenched in her sleeves and her expression was cold. Just as she was about to explode, her gaze fell on the muddy ground next to the bamboo chair and the words drawn on the tree branches. She couldn't help but have a thought, and a strange look appeared in her eyes, causing her to forget what she wanted to say. In the best barracks in the city of Wei, the old man in a shabby robe was resting with his eyes closed. Border General Ma Shixiang was half bowing and talking to the noble in the tent. His humble attitude couldn't hide his surprise. "You're not satisfied with the guide?" he asked confusedly. "Why?" The voice of the noblewoman in the tent was extremely dissatisfied. She reprimanded, "What I want is a smart and capable guide, not a lazy young man whose head is filled with dreams of cultivation and who has no strength to even trust a chicken." Ma Shixiang coughed slightly and explained in a low voice, "As I know, Ning Kei is still young, but he has beheaded many barbarians in the grassland in the past 2 years. If, it is just to have a few chickens, I think it shouldn't be a problem. The cold voice behind the tent paused for a moment and said unhappily, can killing people make a good guide? Ma Shixiang answered more humbly, Ning Ke is definitely not the one who killed the most enemies among the 300 soldiers in the city of Wei. But I can guarantee with my head that no matter how fierce the battlefield is, this lad will definitely be one of the survivors. Then he raised his head and said with a smile, because of his accumulated military achievements, he has received a letter of recommendation from the military ministry. This lad has really worked hard and passed the preliminary examination half a year ago. This time, he will report to the academy after returning to the capital. Hearing the word academy, the noble in the tent suddenly became silent and did not speak again. After Ma Shixiang left, the old man in the shabby robe slowly opened his eyes. There was a rare trace of interest in his old and calm eyes. He looked at the curtain and said with a gentle smile, it is really surprising that a soldier in this small border town can enter the academy. In this case, the lad must be the best in both character and ability. It is not bad to let him be a guide. It has only been a year since I left the country. I did not expect that a sacred place like the academy would start to recruit ruffians. His tone was still cold and disdainful, but his actual attitude had changed. At least the noble no longer objected to Ning Ke being the guide of his team. Only a name was needed to change the mind of a bigwig. That place called the academy must be very complicated. The old man spoke of another matter with a puzzled expression. Previously, I went to see the words he wrote on the muddy ground. He copied the third section of the article on the response of the Tao. The lines of the words were concise but extremely vivid. Even though he only used a branch, when it fell on the wetland, it felt like the edge of a knife and the mud. This soldier named Ning Ke's calligraphy has entered the right path. I really don't know how he practiced it and who his teacher is. That soldier is just an empty brush stroke. When I saw it by chance, I was shocked because of the novelty. Now that I think about it carefully, it is just a strange way of writing. It is not the right path. In the future, he will probably be a calligrapher outside the fragrance workshop in the capital. The noble replied coldly. The old man shook his head and said, the word novelty is the key. I don't know calligraphy, but when I looked at the place where the soldier's branch fell, I could vaguely see the meaning of gold and stone. It is rare to see this kind of character. It is really similar to the skills of the talisman Taoism masters in the Taoist altar. You mean the divine talisman? The noble behind the tent was startled and immediately sneered, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world, but there are only a dozen talisman Taoism masters. Those sublime people either hide in the palace or sit quietly in the temple. They meditate and cultivate their whole lives to condense the chi of heaven and earth between the golden hook and the silver stroke. That lad has no aura at all. He is just an ordinary person. Even if he reads the article on the response of the Tao for another 50 years, I am afraid he can't even step into the initial state. How dare he discuss with those masters? The old man smiled and said nothing more. Although he was a cultivator and was respected by the noble along the way, the difference in status between them was too big. The so-called respect was actually because he cherished the old and cherished the talented. Since that was the case, it was better not to say things that should not be said. Of course, he did not agree with the words of the noble behind the tent. Regarding the soldier named Ning Ke, the old man had his own judgment. In the secular world, there were only a few mortals who could sense the chi of heaven and earth and step into the initial state. The initial stage of sensing was the most difficult and definitely not an easy task. However, if Ning Ke could really enter the academy to study, he might be able to reach the legendary second floor one day and embark on the path of cultivation. His strange yet powerful calligraphy would definitely be of great help to him. Even if he could never be enlightened, his calligraphy alone would be able to make the sublime people in the academy and the Taoist altar look at him differently. At the very least, it would be able to shock those scholars and calligraphers. Ning Kai put down the book in his hand and shook his head as he walked out of the door. There was a faint sense of loss and unwillingness on his face. This was the article on the response of the Tao that he bought with the grain transport team to the market in Kaiping when he was young. As the noble maidservant had said, it was a common book that could be found everywhere. He knew this very well, but he still did not forget to read and study it, as if this book was the legendary 7 volumes of tomes of arcane enshrined in the unknown place of Haotian Taoism. The pages of the book had long been flipped and the corners were curled up, looking extremely shabby. If it were not for Sang Sang sewing the spine tightly with cotton thread, it would have turned into paper money and blown away by the wind to pay tribute to the poor sages. It was a pity that after so many years, the pages of the book had been flipped and the words on it had long been deeply engraved in his mind. However, he still could not understand it. Not to mention the initial state of cultivation, he could not even achieve the simplest sense mentioned in the book. He had once been disappointed and even desperate. Later, he became much calmer after knowing that most ordinary people in this world could not understand the chi of heaven and earth. Yes, those legendary sublime people were not ordinary people, they were all abnormal people. Because only the extremely rare abnormal people could understand the chi of heaven and earth. Otherwise, with so many copies of the article on the response of the Tao circulating in the world, why had he not heard of the night sky of Chang'an, the capital city, being filled with flying swords and sublime people? Ning Kai, on the other hand, was very normal, or rather, very ordinary. However, if you suddenly found a wonderful mountain of treasures in front of you, but you could only go back empty-handed, and suddenly found that the world was filled with that wonderful thing called primordial chi that looked like invisible white clouds, but you could not even catch a piece of cloud, you would still feel a little unwilling, right? The city of Wei is so poor, and the barbarians on the grassland have long been beaten by His Majesty. They have not dared to come for many years, so I can't accumulate military merits too quickly. Of course, it's good to go back to the capital. Why would I feel unwilling? In the dimly lit military camp, Ning Kai respectfully bowed to the general in front of him and explained earnestly, "It's just that there's still some time before the registration day of the academy, so I don't think it's necessary to leave so early. Although I haven't improved by leaps and bounds under your command these years, I've been taught by you to be more like a person, or else I wouldn't have been so lucky to enter the academy. I really want to stay with you in the city of Wei for a few more days, to listen to your teachings. Even if it's just for a while, it's good enough to gossip more." Ma Shixiang looked at the lad in front of him, his beard slightly moving, either because of the night wind or because he was very angry. He said angrily, Ning Kai, when did you become such a shameless guy?" Ning Kai answered seriously, "As long as you need me to, I can do it at any time. Tell me the truth." Ma Shixiang's expression became cold, and he asked seriously, "Why don't you want to be the guide?" Ning Kai was silent for a long time, and then he said in a low voice, "General, the nobleman doesn't like me." "The nobleman doesn't like you?" Ma Shixiang scolded him sternly, "You seem to have forgotten your identity. You are not a student of the academy yet, and as a soldier of the empire, you have to obey the orders of your superiors and me. Whether the nobleman likes you or not, it's not something you should worry about. As for whether you like the nobleman or not, no one will care about it. All you need to do is to accept the order and fulfill it." Chapter 4. The Tang Empire was open-minded, and it was a private conversation in a military tent late at night. But Ma Shixiang still couldn't help becoming nervous when he heard the words, "Her Highness is an idiot." He had been so cautious and nervous since the noble lady entered the city of Wei. He didn't expect that Ning Kai would make such a harsh comment. And he thought that Ning Kai's comment was unfair, so he became even more nervous. Everyone knew that the fourth princess of the Tang Empire was not an idiot, but an extremely virtuous princess. With the strength of the Tang Empire and its military prowess, whether it was facing the grassland barbarians or the other countries in the Central Plains, it would never consider such a humiliating political tactic as a marriage alliance. Apart from a few of the most loyal barbarian generals of Emperor Taizu marrying a few daughters of the royal family, there had never been a similar situation. However, 3 years ago, when the grassland was unstable and the largest barbarian tribe of the Golden Tribe was secretly instigated and supported by the hostile countries of the Tang Empire, the fourth princess, who was 13 or 14 years old and loved by the emperor, knelt in front of the Daming Palace, kowtowed and wept blood. Regardless of the opposition of the whole country, she would rather give up the prosperity of Chang and insisted on marrying the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe to the grassland. When the news spread, the whole world was shocked and people talked about it. The white-haired civil officials sent memorials to the Tang Empire. The emperor was so angry that he smashed countless jade cups. The queen was in a complicated mood and didn't say a word. But all these could not stop the determination of the young princess. After knowing this, the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe of the Grassland felt honored and liked the princess's temperament. He sent an envoy with 5,000 cattle and sheep to the court to ask for her hand in marriage. In the end, the Tang Emperor had no choice but to let his daughter marry the Chanyu of the Grassland in the 11th year of Tianqi era. Less than half a year after the princess married the Chanyu, she and the Chanyu got along well. The once ambitious leader of the barbarians became a calm lion of the grassland. He guarded the country quietly and looked at the foreign land, but he didn't start a war. But no one expected that a few months ago, the Chanyu suddenly died in the prime of his life, and the Chanyu's younger brother forcibly took over the throne. The situation at the border became complicated and tense again. But from the time when the thin girl knelt in front of the Daming Palace to decide the engagement, for 4 or 5 years, the northwest border of the Tang Empire had been in a precious peace. It must be said that most of the credit was due to the princess. Rumor had it that the fourth princess insisted on marrying to the grasslands. A large part of the reason was to avoid the empress. But even if this was true, in the eyes of the military officials and court officials, the fourth princess' act of not relying on the emperor's favor, retreating in front of the empress, and avoiding the intensification of the conflicts in the upper echelons of the empire was a wise and virtuous act. For Tang border generals like Ma Shixiang, they were not afraid of war, let alone those barbarians. They even felt extremely humiliated that the princess was married to the enemy, but no one would refuse the gift of peace. Therefore, their feelings towards Her Royal Highness were very complicated. There was some anger for no reason, but also some gratitude. In the end, all kinds of emotions gradually turned into a trace of respect in the depths of their hearts. Ning Ke was just an ordinary soldier, so he did not know if he could understand the general's complicated feelings. Even if he could, he would not care. Because what he was fighting for now was related to his own safety, and he always thought that there was nothing more important than his own life. So he pretended not to see the general's gloomy face and continued, "I roughly calculated the arrow holes on the carriage. The new Chanyu was very ruthless. I guess at least half of the guards of the princess were killed on the grasslands. It is said that they met the horse gang." Ma Shixiang said with a somewhat unnatural expression. Maybe even he did not believe this. Even the Chanyu of the Golden Tribe would not dare to attack the princess of the Tang Empire. So of course, it can only be the horse gang. But everyone knows who disguised as the horse gang. Ning Ke continued, "But it is not right. Everyone knows that the horse gang is disguised as the cavalrymen of the new Chanyu. How could the barbarian be so bold? Wasn't he afraid that the imperial court would send troops to wipe out the Golden Tribe? The Tang Empire was founded on martial arts. Its people were simple, brave, and ruthless. It was known as the strongest country in the world and cared most about its dignity. However, if it wanted to wipe out the Golden Tribe of the grassland barbarians, it would probably consume more than half of its power. It seemed impossible to throw the empire into turmoil because of an attack on a married princess. But in fact, in the history of the Tang Empire, such impulsive or heroic stories often happened. The most famous example happened in the later years of the founder of the Tang Empire. At that time, a tribe of the grassland massacred a village on the White Goat Path. 140 villagers were killed. The empire's envoy went to condemn them, but the arrogant Chanyu of the tribe cut off their ears and chased them back. Emperor Taizu flew into a rage and decided to personally conquer the grassland. He mobilized the entire empire and supported a mighty army of 80,000 cavalry to conquer the north. But do you think that you can enter the academy just like that? You have been staying at the frontier fortress of the city of Wei all these years. Even if you have heard some legends about the academy, you don't know what kind of place it is. The general's expression was solemn and serious. In the hearts of the people of the Tang Empire, the academy is the most sacred and inviolable place. Having the military ministry's acknowledgement only means that you can participate in the academy entrance examination of the academy. However, if you really want to step into the academy's red gate, you have to go to at least 3 departments to get stamped. Why would those departments care about recommendation letters written by high-ranking officers like us? Even if it's a reply from the military headquarters, it doesn't have much power. As long as they want, they can delay the time for you to participate in the academy entrance examination for several years. In recent years, this has become a common sight. Except for the students accepted by the teachers of the academy from among the common people, any candidate recommended by the imperial court has to spend a lot of money to clear the way. I don't know how many wealthy families have lost their fortune just because of the academy entrance examination. I know that you have saved some money in the city of Wei for the past 2 years, but do you think that you can feed those guys with just a few hundred taels of silver? Ning Kai scratched his head and said with emotion, "No one told me about this before. Because there is a way to solve this problem now, so there is no need to tell you." Ma Shixiang looked at him and said unhappily, "As long as you make a contribution on the road and catch the eye of the nobility, or even if the nobility remembers your name, then any steward in the princess's mansion can just say a few words, and no yaman will dare to blackmail you. This means that I have to gamble with my life for the academy entrance examination of the academy. Why does it sound like a bad deal?" Ning Kai continued to scratch his head. Ma Shixiang stared at him fiercely and scolded, "Idiot! Bastard! In order to enter the academy, I don't know how many people are willing to sell their own mothers and kill their own fathers. Now I just want you to take a small risk, but you are still unwilling to do it." After a while, the general calmed down and advised, "According to my analysis, your highness should also know that her whereabouts can't be kept secret. If you can guess her identity, then all the people in the city of Wei can guess it. How can her enemies in the empire not guess it? In this case, she still insists on going as usual, which means that there must be reinforcements ahead. Your task is just to take her to the mountain shortcut and meet those people as soon as possible. How can it be considered gambling with your life?" Ning Kai lowered his head and said nothing. He kept calculating the gains and losses in this. Ma Xiangsheng looked at his expression and thought of the irritating temper of this lad. He knew that it was difficult to persuade him to take the risk without some visible benefits. He could not help but sigh and said in a low voice, "There is an old man in the team of your highness. His surname is Liu, and I heard that he cultivates in the South School of Haotian Taoism." Hearing this, Ning Kai suddenly raised his head, and his usually calm and lazy eyes suddenly became extremely bright. Ma Xiangsheng looked at him and said with emotion, "You came to the city of Wei when you were still a little boy. You used your sweet words and skills to please all the young and old men in the city. The soldiers changed one batch after another. Even the meat pie shop in the eastern city had changed 2 bosses. But you are still the most favored little boy in the city of Wei, the bandit's nest." He rubbed Ning Kai's head as if he was looking at a spoiled child, and said, "That year before the former general passed away, he got you a military record. Then in the autumn when we went to the grassland to collect firewood, we were almost killed by those barbarians. It was only because of you that we escaped. At that time, all the people in the city of Wei unanimously decided to reward you. We even thought that even if your condition was to use the capital's most popular prostitute, we would all pool our money to do it beautifully. The gray-haired general changed the topic and said bitterly, but no one expected that you would want to learn those extraterrestrial methods. It's so frustrating. The entire city of Wei, even the entire 7 stockade villages, could not find a teacher for you. We could only watch you read the article on the response of the Tao until it was torn and tattered, and we could do nothing about it. But now is the opportunity. Ma Xiangsheng's eyes suddenly became sharp. Whether it is the academy or the old man surnamed Liu, you must catch them. You must catch them. Ning Ke was silent for a long time, and then he lowered his head and sighed softly. Actually, I'm still a little reluctant. The starlight outside the window was faint. Ma Xiangsheng looked at the lad and said, "The city of Wei is too small after all. You should go to the capital Chang'an, to the real big world. Maybe there are many fierce dragons and tigers in those places, but you are a newborn calf, who are you really afraid of? At least, those places will not only have a tattered article on the response of the Tao." Ning Ke answered with a frown. In fact, he was very serious about it. He was not very clear that 10 taels of silver, to the students of the academy, might be the price of a table of banquets in a big restaurant in the heavenly fragrance market. Just like the famous joke in Heshi Road, a farmer who worked in the fields always imagined that the Empress of the East was baking meat pies, and the Empress of the West was peeling green onions. The meat pies were like the sea, and the green onions were like the mountains. However, even this obviously wrong answer had far exceeded the bottom line of the little handmaiden's heart. She frowned and looked at him seriously, and suggested, "It is too expensive. Ning Ke, let's not go to Chang'an, and you should also not enter the academy, okay? You are so ignorant." Ning Ke reprimanded, "If I enter the academy, I will definitely become an official. At that time, you and I will spend 10 taels of silver a month, and I will casually earn 70 or 80 taels of silver a month in the yamen. Besides, what is wrong with Chang'an? Chenjinji Cosmetic Store doesn't need too much rouge and powder." The words rouge and powder seemed to be the little handmaiden's weakness. She tightly pursed her lips, obviously in a very fierce psychological struggle. After a long time, she replied in a mosquito-like voice, "But what about the years you study in the academy? My needlework is ordinary, and the people of Chang'an must have high standards. I may not be able to sell it. This is indeed troublesome. I heard that hunting is not allowed around Chang'an, and those mountains and forests belong to the emperor. How much money do we have left?" The master and the handmaiden looked at each other, and then tacitly walked to the 2 big elm chests. They opened the chests and took out a very tightly wrapped wooden box from the deepest part of the chest. The wooden box was filled with scattered pieces of silver. There were obvious scratches on the fingernail-sized pieces of silver, and there was only one big piece of silver in the middle. At first glance, one could tell that it was accumulated bit by bit on a daily basis, but there wasn't much of it. Looking at the scattered silver in the wooden box, neither of them counted it. Sang Sang whispered, "As usual, count it once every 5 days. I just counted it last night. 76 taels and 4 fun. It seems that we have to find a way to earn more money after we go to Chang'an." Ning Ke said seriously. "Yes, I will strive to improve my needlework." Sang Sang answered seriously. At night, Sang Sang knelt on the Kong bed and tidied up the bedding. Her skinny knees moved quickly, and her small palm pressed the middle of the pillow to make an arc, which was the most comfortable angle for Ning Ke to sleep. Then she picked up her bedding and jumped off the cold Kong. She walked to the 2 big elm chests in the corner and began to make her own bed. The maidservant turned around and scolded the little boy severely. Then her expression became gentle again. She held him in her arms and rubbed his head affectionately. A corner of the curtain was lifted by the wind, and the spring breeze blew on her cheeks, which were no longer as tender as before. The maidservant squinted slightly and looked at the front of the team with a gloomy expression. The young soldier named Ning Kei was sitting on the shaft of the relatively simple carriage at the very front. He kept nodding his head as if he was about to fall asleep. As a guide, he was supposed to lead the way for the whole team, but he was dozing off most of the time. No matter how one looked at it, he couldn't be considered competent. The maidservant's expression was not because of this, but because of a detail in the scene she saw. Ning Kei was dozing on the shaft of the carriage, and it seemed that he would fall from the galloping carriage at any time. So the little maidservant Sang Sang stayed vigilantly by his side, trying to support him with her thin and short body. Her expression could not be seen clearly on her dark face, but it could be felt that she was very tired. At this moment, the caravan ran over a very shallow grassy stream. Ning Kei was awakened by the shock. He rubbed his eyes and glanced at the sky. He found that he had slept until dusk, so he raised his hand to signal the caravan to stop and set up camp. It seemed a little irresponsible and reckless to set up camp right after waking up, but no one in the team objected to his arrangement. It had been several days since they left the city of Wei, and every decision made by the young man along the way had been proven to be correct. Whether it was the choice of route, the location of the camp, the security, the use of water to eat, or the convenience of escape, there was no fault to be found. What was even more amazing was that the caravan moved quite fast. The dozens of barbarian horse gangs subdued by the noblemen in the grassland had originally looked down on the border army of the city of Wei, but now they only had admiration for the young soldier's ability as a guide. On the bank of the stream, people silently dug earth, built stoves, and collected firewood to boil water. The maidservant got off the expensive carriage that was heavily protected. She looked at Ning Kei, who was lying on the grass and rubbing his stomach as if he was on a picnic, and at the thin and dark handmaiden who was struggling to fetch water, set up a pot and collect firewood. She frowned even more. A strong guard next to her stood up and glanced at her. She shook her head, indicating that there was no need to follow. She walked along the bank of the stream and through the smoke. She had to admit that the lad named Ning Kei was indeed capable. He was much better than those young noblemen in the capital of Chang and who thought that they were outstanding. Sang Sang frowned and tried hard to recall for a long time. Then she replied, "It seems like, I don't like to talk." Most of the time, it was her talking about the grassland, but I can't remember what she said. Upon hearing this, Ning Kei's mood became much better. He gently hummed a tune and chewed the delicious dried milk. He said, "If she talks to you again in the future, remember to ask for money from her, or bring more of this dried milk back. It's not a bad idea." At night, Sang Sang used the stream water to extinguish the fire. After careful confirmation, she dragged the bucket of hot water to the small tent. People on the slope beside the stream saw this scene and knew that the little handmaiden was preparing the water for Ning Kei to wash his feet. Many people showed disdainful expressions at the same time. Of course, this disdain was for Ning Quebec. After washing his feet, Ning Kei crawled into the wool mattress and hugged the pair of cold feet that stretched out from the opposite side into his arms. He made a moan that was unknown whether it was pleasure or pain. After 2 yawns, he said, "Go to sleep." Sang Sang was much more tired than him during the day and fell into a deep sleep after a while. Ning Kei didn't know when he opened his eyes again. His gaze seemed to penetrate the tent that had been mended with many scars, falling on the starry sky, and then on a handkerchief. Recalling the handkerchief with golden edges taken out by the handmaiden, he knew that his guess was indeed correct. But he didn't know what use it was even if he guessed correctly. Chapter 8. Looking at the top of the tent, Ning Kei thought of the traces after he left the city of Wei. Along the way, the curtain of the luxurious horse carriage was always closed. Except for the little boy, who obviously had barbarian blood, who occasionally got off the carriage to play, there was no chance to see the princess at all. Only the delicate and arrogant maidservant gave orders from time to time. Somehow, the maidservant liked to call Sang Sang over for a chat. Or somehow, the maidservant did not hide her dislike for him at all. Ning Ke felt that she was a very good actress. Because no matter in the city of Wei or on the journey, it was hard to tell that she was not a maidservant from the attitude of those grassland men and her temperament and expression. It was this point that made him feel a little strange. He always thought that the real nobles in the upper class of the Tang Empire should not have too much sympathy for Sang Sang. But these were not the things he really cared about. In the past few days, he had been paying attention to the old man in an old robe in the horse carriage. If he guessed correctly, the old man with a gentle expression should be the sublime being from the South School of Haotian Taoism mentioned by General Ma. Since he was very young, Ning Ke had been determined to step into that mysterious world, but he could not find the right way. He was willing to go back to the capital with this team because there was such a real cultivator in the team. Unfortunately, along the way, he had never found a chance to talk to the old man who was closely protected. Only when they stopped to eat in the camp, he could occasionally meet the old man's eyes for a moment. At that moment, he seemed to see the gentleness and even encouragement in the old man's eyes, which made him a little puzzled. Ning Ke could not figure it out after thinking and analyzing, so he withdrew his attention. Only then did he find that the pair of little feet in his arms had not been warmed, and were still as cold as a lump of ice. Even his chest and abdomen were cold. He could not help but frown worriedly. The little handmaiden Sang Sang had suffered too much when she was young. She was wrapped in wind and rain and rotten air by the side of the road for several days, and after being picked up by him, she became seriously ill and did not recover for several months. The military doctor in the city of Wei had examined her, and he had even taken her to the faraway Kaiping prefecture to have a look. All the doctors had the same opinion, congenitally deficient, with a weak and cold constitution. Due to her extremely cold physique, Sang Sang rarely sweated. She could not expel the waste toxins that were produced every day, which made her body worse and worse over time. Therefore, Ning Ke followed the doctor's advice and made her do a large amount of exercise every day to slightly improve the cold environment in her body. This was also the real reason why he always ordered this dark and skinny little handmaiden around like a donkey in the eyes of others. Even if she worked so hard every day, it didn't always warm her up. For example, at this moment, the woolen mattress was like an ice house. Ning Ke got up and rubbed his frozen stomach. He took out the leather wineskin from the corner and patted Sang Sang awake. Then he put the wineskin to her lips. Sang Sang opened her eyes in a daze and took the wineskin naturally. She skillfully unscrewed the cork and tilted her head back to pour the wine into her mouth. Not a single drop of wine spilled out, but the tent was still filled with the spicy aroma of wine. It seemed to be the strong wine used in the grassland. The skinny little handmaiden held the big wineskin and drank to her heart's content. 2 bowls of strong wine could knock out a big man, but she drank half of the bag in one go until her stomach slightly bulged. It was hard to describe this scene as heroic, but a little weird. She wiped her lips, and her willow-like eyes became brighter in the dark. It was impossible to tell that she had drunk wine. She smiled at Ning Ke and then fell back to sleep. The room was filled with the strong aroma of wine. The cold feet in his arms gradually warmed up. Ning Ke looked at the few drops of sweat on the tip of her nose and finally felt relieved. He wiped the sweat on his forehead. Ning Ke wrapped the woolen mattress tightly and slowly closed his eyes. Not far from his face was the tattered article on the response of the Tao. Every day before he slept, he would read a few pages. Even if he didn't read it, he would silently recite it in his heart. It was a habit that he had developed over the years. May all living beings cultivate the art of dying of old age. May all disasters and poisons not harm their lives. May all living beings never grow old or get sick, live a long life, and enter the path of wisdom bravely. In his light sleep, his mind began to slowly circulate along with the words on the scroll, along with those seemingly simple but actually muddy and difficult to understand perception techniques. Gradually, the woolen mattress covering him and Sang Sang disappeared, the simple tent disappeared, the grass outside the tent disappeared, and the stream turned into a cloud of white mist and then became invisible. The whole world became a world of mutual existence. In this world, they could vaguely feel some kind of breathing in a mysterious rhythm. Between the breath of the world gradually became a sea, and it was a warm world. Ning Ke was no stranger to this magical feeling. Many years ago, after he read the article on the response of the Tao for the first time, he could often feel it before he fell asleep. But he was very clear about the sad fact that this was not a real feeling after meditation, but a dream. The warm ocean was probably an illusion in the dream, because the pair of feet wrapped in thick cotton socks in his arms gradually became warm. But it was also a very beautiful illusion. Comforting himself in this way, Ning Ke fell into a deep sleep. It was a dark and sweet night without dreams. When he woke up the next morning, Ning Ke slept very well. But his expression was full of shock and dissatisfaction, as if he wanted to sleep for another 3 days and 3 nights. Why did you change the route? Looking at the indifferent maidservant in front of him, he suppressed his emotions and said as gently as possible, "Go through Min Mountain and straight to Huaxi Road. There will be no problem with the route I chose." No one in the tent, including the maidservant, answered his question. "I am the guide, and you are not familiar with Min Mountain at all." Ning Ke looked at the maidservant and said after a moment of silence, "I know you are worried about being ambushed. I can assure you that as long as you listen to me, no one can stop you." The maidservant looked at him as if looking at a stone. What she wanted to express was very clear: "What qualifications do you have for me to explain to you?" Returning to his own tent, Ning Ke looked at Sang Sang who was packing and said, "Send them to this road and we will leave immediately." Taking out the simple map that he had drawn years ago, he pointed at a place and said, "This is the furthest we can follow them. If we go any further, they will only need to send a few teams of horses to kill this team. You should persuade them." Sang Sang said with her head raised. "I guess there are troops coming to the rescue of the princess, so they will not listen to me." Ning Ke replied, "I am not good at persuading a group of pig-like companions." Sang Sang did not speak but asked with her eyes, "Since there are people coming to the rescue, why are you still so worried and even ready to slip away halfway?" "My intuition is wrong." Ning Ke replied, "Because I believe that a fierce person who dares to assassinate the 4th princess of the Tang Empire will not be as stupid as that woman. She has a few backup plans." Sang Sang wanted to say something but stopped and reminded him, "You should speak politely to her. I know her real identity." Ning Ke raised his eyebrows and said sarcastically, "So what if she is a princess? I have said in the city of Wei that she is an idiot princess." Chapter 10. A muffled sound was heard. Like a sharp metal thorn stabbing into dozens of stacked wet papers, the arrow shot into the chest of a bodyguard beside the luxurious carriage. The bearded young man covered his bleeding chest and fell down. At the moment when Ning Ke shouted that the enemy was under attack, the well-trained bodyguard of the princess quickly reacted. The bodyguard bravely jumped onto the shaft of the carriage and blocked the window of Her Highness's carriage. He did not know where the arrow would be shot, but he knew that Her Highness inside the carriage must be the enemy's first target, and he could not let Her Highness's life be threatened. The brave bodyguard made the right bet, and the price he paid was his young life. Enemy attack. Protect Her Highness. Shield. The bodyguards roared angrily and in shock. Countless arrows shot out densely from the depths of the dense forest like a rainstorm, and they whistled as they instantly caused the whistling sound of the wind to vanish without a trace, causing it to seem extremely terrifying. Ning Ke, who was still some distance away from the circle, immediately lay down. At the same time, he did not forget to throw Sang Sang and the maidservant who followed him out of the tent. He fell heavily in the forest, but he did not feel much pain because the ground was covered with hundreds of thousands of years old rotten pine leaves on the northern mountain road. With his face against the slightly cool leaves, he listened to the dense sounds of arrows piercing through the air in front of him, and occasionally listened to the sound of arrows flying over his head. He silently calculated the number of archers and the number of arrows they used. The entrance of the northern mountain road was surrounded by the angry and anxious shouts of the bodyguards, the orders to set up defenses, and the extremely heavy sound of shields being set up. The big shields made of carriage boards were inserted into the edge of the shafts by the bodyguards, which played a great role. Thud. 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 The arrows fiercely pierced into the simple wooden shields, making a dull sound like a war drum, but it was more frequent and terrifying than the craziest war drum. From time to time, some arrows shot through the gaps of the simple wooden shields and hit the bodyguards, causing a muffled groan. Unfortunately, the horses that were hit by the arrows were not as fierce and strong as the men of the empire, and fell to the ground in pain and wailed. The sound of arrows piercing through the air, the sound of arrows hitting wooden shields, the muffled groans of people, and the mournful neighing of horses were mixed together, turning the camp that was previously shrouded in warm twilight into a sure hell. Shio! An arrow fiercely shot into the mud less than half a foot in front of Ning Ke, splashing soil and gravel on his face, instantly leaving a red mark. However, his facial expression did not change at all. He quietly crawled on the rotten pine needles, looking through the gaps between the leaves, over the shaft of the arrow, and at the distant northern mountain road in the south. The enemy did not choose to launch an ambush in the dense forest of the northern mountain road, nor did they choose to attack at night. Instead, they chose to attack in the evening when the caravan had just arrived at the entrance of the northern mountain road. Even though Ning Ke had a natural intuition for danger since childhood, he still did not think of this. Dusk was the time when people were most likely to relax and their guard was at its lowest. Moreover, the convoy was about to meet the Gushan Commandery's reinforcement team, so it was inevitable that people would relax a little. These enemies must be taking advantage of this. Vaguely, he saw many figures appearing in the dense forest on both sides of the northern mountain road. Based on the previous calculation of the density of arrows and what he could see, he roughly estimated the number of enemies to be about 60. After all, they were in the territory of the Tang Empire, and the enemy wanted to assassinate His Majesty's favorite fourth princess. Whether for the sake of secrecy before or after the assassination, the enemy could not use a real large force, so they could only choose the most loyal men of sacrifice. Since they were men of sacrifice, the number of them naturally could not be too large. However, Ning Ke was very clear that in a fight on the battlefield, the more people there were, the more powerful they would be. On the contrary, a team composed of all fearless men of sacrifice was the most difficult to deal with. The bigwigs of the empire arranged such a shocking assassination. In addition to men of sacrifice, they might even ask cultivators to help. Thinking that he might see the battle between those powerhouses on the battlefield today, Ning Ke inexplicably felt a kind of inexplicable excitement in his heart, and then he felt an unprecedented fear. How unlucky I am! He muttered as he turned around to glance at the maidservant beside him. He noticed that besides the panic and bewilderment that had appeared in her eyes in the beginning, the young lady had actually swiftly calmed down, and he couldn't help but silently praise her in his heart. The enemies on both sides of the dense forest had already poured out. Those men in grey Tang army uniforms did not cover their faces. They were waving the standard steel knives in their hands and pouncing forward at high speed like a pack of wolves. Since they did not hide their identities, it was obvious that one side would be completely slaughtered. The fierce barbarians around the convoy were the horse gang subdued by Her Highness on the grassland. They had long been stimulated by the previous arrow rain. It seemed that his body, which was covered by his robe, was also covered in those tiny beads of blood, just like his exposed face and hands. The middle-aged scholar raised his sleeves to wipe the blood and sweat on his eyebrows. He looked at the old man beside the carriage and the empty scabbard beside the old man, and sighed with a low voice, "One wrong move leads to many wrong moves." Liu Qingchen, the minister of offerings of the South School of Haotian Taoism, actually, abandoned the sword and cultivated the psyche. If this news was spread out, I don't know how many people would be shocked. After a short silence, he sighed with emotion, "What's more unexpected is that you can actually enter the see-through state at such an old age. Is there any secret method of Haotian Taoism?" The old man's name was Liu Qingchen. He answered softly, "I followed Her Highness to the north for a year. I saw some different scenery and people on the grassland. I was touched, so my state improved. It has nothing to do with our Taoism." Hearing this unexpected explanation, the middle-aged scholar was stunned for a moment. He seemed to understand something and kept silent for a long time. Then he looked at the guard leader who was kneeling on one knee among the fallen leaves with a saber, and said in a very serious tone, "Since I entered the great sword master state, I have always thought that the secular force could not compete with me. Today, you and your subordinates have taught me a lesson." The middle-aged scholar cupped his hands to salute the guards who were seriously injured among the fallen leaves, and praised, "Brave and fearless soldiers like you are the pride of our Tang Empire." The guard leader slightly bowed and did not say anything. "There are not many great sword masters in Chang'an, but I don't know you." The old man Liu Qingchen looked at the middle-aged scholar who was covered with blood and said, "The academy is really a place of hidden talents." Hearing the word academy, the people who survived in the forest at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road could not help but feel confused and shocked. Could it be that the assassination against Her Highness had something to do with the high status of the academy? Ning Ke subconsciously looked at the maidservant beside him, and saw that she had a thoughtful expression on her face. Obviously, she did not believe this statement. The middle-aged scholar was stunned for a moment, and then he shook his head and said sadly, "I didn't expect that you could see through my background. But as an unworthy junior, I dare not bring shame to the academy. I'm just a stupid student who was expelled from the academy." He was covered with blood, and his body was shaking, as if he could fall at any time. However, facing such an enemy, the grassland barbarians and guards who survived in the carriages were very nervous, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. Take in the heaven and the earth. Seeing this scene, Liu Qingchen suddenly changed his expression, and looked at the middle-aged scholar angrily and scolded, "People from the academy use the methods of the devil's doctrine. You, how dare you betray your teacher?" The battle at the entrance of the Northern Mountain Road was extremely dangerous and tragic, but the old man was not moved from the beginning to the end. In the eyes of the Tangs, since there were already two camps of enemies, it was normal to win or lose, and it did not involve the so-called morality and justice. But when he found that the middle-aged scholar used the self-destruction method of the devil's doctrine, he finally could not help but be angry for the first time. If you are on the right path, you don't need to fear the devil's doctrine. The middle-aged scholar slowly raised his right arm, pointing at the old man beside the carriage, and said indifferently, "If this is the oblivion, then let me sink into the underworld, and never be reincarnated." As soon as he finished speaking, a deep blood mark suddenly appeared at the base of his right index finger, and the white bone could be vaguely seen. With a muffled groan, his index finger was pulled away from his palm, and suddenly sped up, turning into a blood shadow, rushing towards Liu Qingqian's face. Taking in the chi of heaven and earth in the body, at the risk of breaking his body, and turning his body into a flying sword, condensing all his skills into a strike, was the most typical method of the devil's doctrine. For the team escorting the princess, Liu Qingqian was their strongest support, especially at this time, when the grassland barbarians and guards had suffered heavy casualties, and almost no one had the strength to fight anymore. Therefore, the role of the old man was particularly important. If he died under this broken finger, who else could resist the critical strike of a great sword master before his death? Two grassland barbarians rushed towards the middle-aged scholar, howling madly, but before they could run 2 steps, they staggered and fell on the fallen leaves, and the machetes in their hands were also shaken out. The guard leader, who was half kneeling, suddenly fell to the ground, and struggled to crawl forward, dragging blood with him. Not far from him, there was a crossbow arrow left by a dead guard. Although he had tried his best, it was obvious that he was still too slow. When he grabbed the crossbow arrow, Liu Qingqian, who was too weak to fight anymore, had already been stabbed by the broken finger. In the dark forest at the entrance of the northern mountain road, no one had expected that a great sword master from the academy would use the method of the devil's doctrine. No one was prepared, and it seemed that they could only watch the great sword master successfully kill them, and then the whole team would die. Ning Ke was prepared. He had prepared for a long time. In the firelight, the maidservant looked at Ning Ke's face and thought so. The assassins, who had been killing in the dark all their lives, were most sensitive to danger. Even the maidservant could feel the hidden danger under Ning Ke's calm and focused expression. When the 2 black-robed assassins stared at the lad who jumped over the wall of fire, they subconsciously felt nervous, even more nervous than when they assassinated the Yen army. Their hands holding the long swords were inexplicably stiff. In the whistling wind, Ning Ke jumped between the 2 assassins. The corner of his cotton robe was burned, leaving several faint lines of fire in the dense forest at night. 2 rusty long knives were pulled out from behind his shoulders at lightning speed and swung over like a storm. A series of extremely ear-piercing sounds of metal blades colliding suddenly rang out in the forest. Where the strong wind blew, the weak line of fire brought about by the burning cotton robe was blown into even finer sparks, but it illuminated the battlefield even brighter than before. When the knives and swords collided, Ning Ke's body bounced forward and his feet took several steps on the fallen leaves. He forcibly inserted himself between the 2 assassins in black. He turned his wrist and turned his knife to drag, slashing diagonally along the back of the opponent's sword. He did not give the opponent any chance to change his move. Instead, he suppressed his opponent's momentum and slashed into the opponent's ribs. The heavy blades cut through the 2 assassins' sternum from the bottom and cut into their chests. Blood and flesh were squeezed out of the blades. The 2 assassins howled miserably. At the moment of death, they abandoned their swords and used their hands to trap Ning Ke's blades with their own bodies, using the strong willpower of the Tang soldiers. At this moment, another assassin in black fell like a ghost. The short knife in his hands was bright, and he slashed at the back of Ning Ke's neck. There was a 3rd assassin in the forest. No matter how one looked at it, the 2 assassins should be making their last attempt. Unexpectedly, they still had a backup plan. This method seemed redundant, but in fact, it was full of ruthlessness at the expense of the lives of their companions and their own withered leaves. No one could have expected such a situation, except for Ning Ke himself and the little handmaiden under the black umbrella. 6. 2. The little handmaiden under the black umbrella nervously shrank her body. Just when the third assassin slashed at Ning Ke, she closed her eyes tightly and used all her strength to shout 2 words. 2 simple numbers. What could they remind Ning Ke of? Was it a code word or a direction indication?